Okay, muri Zimbabwe, welcome back pamzinda wevanhu kubva kuvanhu by public demand. With me, your host, Super Nexus. So, muri Zimbabwe, we have a bombshell. ZANU-PF makes its biggest move yet. So, Zimbabwean politics has entered a completely different phase. Zimbabwe. For months, Zimbabweans have been watching the battle around 2030, the future of President Emerson Mnangagwa, the succession question inside ZANU-PF, and the increasingly heated arguments over the country's constitution. But now, the political game has moved far beyond speculation. The biggest question is no longer whether ZANU-PF wants to change the political timetable. The question is what this change means for the future of Zimbabwe. Because what started as a political proposal has now become a constitutional reality, and that is why this latest development deserves serious attention. ZANU-PF has spent months defending its position that Zimbabwe needs political continuity in order to achieve Vision 2030. Critics, however, have viewed the process very differently, arguing that the changes fundamentally alter the country's political system and strengthen the position of the ruling establishment. The constitutional changes were passed through Parliament and the Senate before President Mnangagwa signed them into law in July 2026. And the changes extended presidential and parliamentary terms from 5 years to 7 years and introduced a major change to the way future presidents will be chosen. That is not a small adjustment. That is a major change to the rules of Zimbabwean politics. And this is where things get interesting, because whenever the rules of the political game change, the people who understand the game best are usually the first ones thinking about what comes next. So, what exactly has ZANU-PF achieved? And more importantly, what happens next? The 2030 question. For years, Zimbabwean politics has revolved around elections: who is going to contest, who is going to win, who will challenge ZANU-PF, who will become president. But the constitutional changes have altered that conversation. Under the new framework, the political timetable has been pushed toward 2030, allowing Mnangagwa to remain in office until then. That means the succession question has been given more time to develop. And that could be one of the most important consequences of this entire political process. Because the longer a sitting president remains at the center of political power, the longer every faction inside the ruling party has to position itself. And believe me, Zimbabwean politics is all about positioning. One politician makes a statement, another politician attends a rally, another receives an important appointment, another suddenly becomes extremely visible. And the Zimbabweans start asking the same question: who is preparing for the future? That is where the story becomes much bigger than Mnangagwa himself. The succession battle. ZANU-PF is not just a political party. It is a massive political machine with decades of history, powerful personalities, provincial structures, veterans, ministers, legislators, youth structures, and competing interests. Whenever the question of succession becomes serious, Zimbabwe, every faction begins thinking about the same thing: who comes next? Vice President Constantino Chiwenga remains one of the most important figures in that conversation, but the succession question is not simply about one person. It is about influence, it is about alliances, it is about who controls which structures, it is about who can mobilize support, and it is about who can convince the party that they represent the future. The biggest mistake outsiders can make is assuming that Zimbabwean politics is simply Mnangagwa versus the opposition. Inside the ZANU-PF itself, there are political calculations taking place that can be just as important. That is why 2030 matters. The extra political runway gives the ruling party more time to manage its succession question, and that could either strengthen ZANU-PF or expose deeper divisions. Why the opposition should be watching? Now, let's talk about the opposition. Because while everyone is watching what ZANU-PF is doing, there is another question that Zimbabweans should be asking. What is the opposition doing about it? The constitutional changes have already demonstrated something important about Zimbabwe's current political balance. ZANU-PF was able to secure the parliamentary numbers necessary to push the changes through. That means the opposition cannot simply rely on public anger to change the political equation. It needs organization, it needs structures, it needs strategy, and most importantly, it needs to understand the rules of the new political environment. Because the rules have changed, the system now provides for future presidents to be elected by parliament rather than through a direct popular presidential vote. That could fundamentally change how political parties approach elections. Think about it. If parliament becomes the decisive arena for choosing the presidency, the parliamentary representation becomes even more important. Every seat matters, every alliance matters, every political party matters, every faction matters. And suddenly, winning parliamentary seats is not simply about controlling parliament. It can potentially determine who controls the presidency. That is a completely different political calculation. ZANU-PF's biggest move is this one. ZANU-PF's biggest move, Zimbabwe, because when people say ZANU-PF has made its biggest move yet, what exactly are they talking about? It is not simply that Mnangagwa has gained more time. It is that the constitutional framework governing Zimbabwe's political future has been changed. That is the bigger story. The party did not merely campaign for a political decision. It successfully pushed a constitutional process through the country's institutions, and now the changes are law. That gives the 2030 question an entirely different meaning. The political debate has moved from will this happen to what does Zimbabwe look like after this happens? And that is the question that could dominate Zimbabwean politics for years. But here is another side. Supporters of the changes have presented the argument differently. Their position is essentially that Zimbabwe needs continuity. They argue that constant election cycles can create political uncertainty and distract from economic development. The government has linked the changes to its broader Vision 2030 agenda and the desire to maintain continuity in implementing its development program. From that perspective, the argument is straightforward. Why interrupt the current program when the government believes it is making progress? Why create another election cycle before the development program is complete? Why not allow the administration to continue until 2030? That is the argument supporters can make, but critics see the issue differently. They argue that changing constitutional rules around presidential elections and terms of office raises fundamental questions about democratic accountability. And that is why this issue has become so explosive. It is not merely about one politician. It is about the rules that determine how Zimbabwe chooses its future leaders. The question everyone will eventually ask, there is one question that is going to become increasingly difficult for ZANU-PF to avoid. Who comes after Mnangagwa? Because even with the political timetable extended, succession does not disappear. It simply gets more time to develop. And the longer the question remains unanswered, the more political speculation there will be. Who is gaining influence? Who is losing influence? Who is being promoted? Who is being sidelined? Who is building relationships across provinces? Who is speaking for the next generation? And perhaps most importantly, who does the party believe can eventually hold the ZANU-PF together in the next era? Those questions are going to produce political drama, because political succession is rarely quiet. Right? The Chiwenga factor. Whatever anyone thinks of him politically, it would be impossible to discuss Zimbabwe's succession debate without acknowledging his importance. He has a long political history, enormous visibility, and a position at the very top of the state. That makes him an unavoidable part of any conversation about ZANU-PF's future. But politics is unpredictable. Being powerful today does not automatically mean becoming president tomorrow. History has shown us that political fortunes can change incredibly quick. A person who looks unstoppable can suddenly lose influence. A politician who appears quiet can suddenly become extremely important. And sometimes the person everyone is watching is not even the person who eventually emerges. That is why the next few years could become fascinating. The bigger power game. Zimbabwe has now entered a period where the political chessboard looks completely different. The 2028 election question has effectively been replaced by a much bigger 2030 political horizon. The constitutional changes have altered the electoral framework. ZANU-PF has secured the political continuity it was seeking, and the opposition has now to figure out how it operates under a new system. But there's another battle happening underneath all of this, the battle for the future. Because every political leader knows that today's decisions can determine tomorrow's power struggle. That is why appointments matter. That is why party conferences matter. That is why provincial politics matters. That is why public speeches matter. That is why alliances matter. And that is why Zimbabweans will be watching every movement inside ZANU-PF. So, this is only the beginning. The biggest mistake would be to think the constitutional amendment is the end of the story. It is actually the beginning of a new chapter. The rules have changed. Now the politicians have to play under those rules. ZANU-PF has bought itself political space. The opposition has to respond. Potential successors have more time to position themselves, and ordinary Zimbabweans will be watching to see whether this new political arrangement delivers the stability and development its supporters promise, or whether it produces an even bigger struggle over power. One thing is certain, Zimbabwean politics is not becoming boring. It is becoming more complicated. And as 2030 approaches, the question will become louder and louder. Who really controls the future of Zimbabwe? Because today's biggest political move may not be remembered simply as the moment Mnangagwa's time in office was extended. It may eventually be remembered as the moment Zimbabwe's entire political game changed. And if that is true, then the biggest battle has not happened yet. Mawan, zvinhu zviri kuitika. So, Zimbabwe, stay tuned. Thank you for watching. Ndini wenyu Super. Peace.